Thank you for joining us again for another one of our Safer at Home virtual talks. I'm Mark Schmidt, if I haven't had a chance to meet you. So we hope that this brings you some education, information, entertainment. I hope that you were watching the PowerPoint before there. We want to thank our sponsors, Cape Cod 5, First Citizens Federal Credit Union, Martha's Vineyard Savings for making these talks possible. Also, we want to let you know that 8 Cousins in Falmouth will have copies of all of our books. Thank you for your support. Thank you for joining us tonight. If you're not a member of the museums, we hope that you will join us. We encourage you to enjoy and see all of our programs by going to museumsonthegreen.org. And it gives me great pleasure tonight to welcome a longtime friend of mine.
That's all I did.
A gentleman named Casey Sherman, who I know many of you have actually had the pleasure of meeting him before. Casey is a well-published, well thought of author, and also a local boy. That you're talking about someone who graduated from Barnstable High, so he's very familiar with the Cape. One thing I'm going to ask all of you to do, if you would mute yourself, I wanted to let you know that this is going to be recorded. Casey, if you haven't had the pleasure of meeting him before, has been to Falmouth before. He has written several books by himself. One called, the first one is A Rose for Mary, a book called Animal, a book called Bad Blood, a book called Black Irish. And he has also been teaming up with a gentleman named David Wedge. Case, I believe this is your 4th collaboration. If you're familiar with Casey's work, he wrote Boston Strong. He wrote a book about Pete Frady's The Ice Bucket Challenge, and also 12, The Inside Story of Tom Brady's Fight for Redemption. Now, Case, I don't know why you wrote about a Tampa Bay quarterback, but that's thing. But ladies and gentlemen, would you welcome Casey Sherman?
Thank you, Mark. Thanks, everybody, for joining us tonight. We're very excited to be talking about our newest book, Hunting Whitey, the inside story of the capture and killing of America's most wanted crime boss. And that's exactly what this story is. We wanted to take the Whitey Bulger case into a kind of a different direction from anything that's been written about Bulger before or mythologized on film or in television. And I think we've been able to achieve that.
Case, let me ask you some questions here. We'll do it a little way like kind of an interview thing. So, Whitey Bulger, we all heard the name. We've kind of grew. I certainly have. I moved out here from Chicago in 1985, and it was a name that I immediately became familiar with. Why did you decide to write this book?
Well, Mark, we were never going to write a book about Whitey Bulger because we thought the story had already been told. And then Bulger was murdered in prison in 2018 under very mysterious circumstances. So my partner, Dave Wedge, and I, we kind of had to step back a little bit and look at the Bulger case from a 30,000-foot view and ask the questions that had yet to be answered. What was he doing for the 16 years that he was a fugitive? What was his life like in prison? How and why was he killed? So we set out to answer all those questions, and we were amazed because we got unprecedented access to the entire investigation for the very first time.
What kind of access did you get? The people closest to Whitey, did they make themselves available to?
Well, we had to do a lot of gumshoeing in this case. And, Dave Wedge and I are old investigative journalists from Boston. So, we know how to do that, but we were also very lucky as well. We got Billy Bulger, Whitey Bulger's brother, to break his silence for the first time in a decade. So Billy Bulger talks about his brother's life and his death in the book. We also got unprecedented access to the FBI. And the FBI was finally willing to tell its story, both the good and the bad. Obviously, Whitey Bulger was a criminal that, Mark, you grew up in Chicago, so you'll appreciate this. I'd put him up there with Al Capone just in terms of the notoriety of crime bosses in American history. And I think he's probably the smartest organized crime figure that we've ever come across, because he was able to co-opt the FBI in the 1970s, 1980s, and early 1990s, really to do his bidding for him. And what really, made Bulger a legend, if you will, is the fact that he escaped justice in the winter of 1994 and remained on the run for 16 years. So I think when I approached the FBI to tell this story, I kind of approached them at the right time. They were willing to open up their entire case file to me and allow me to interview the investigators and the agents that hunted Bulger for 16 years and eventually caught him. And, we also had access to 70 letters that Bulger wrote in his own hand. So for the first time, the readers can really get inside Bulger's mind and understand what he was thinking, including, when he was arrested. Bulger himself describes that very detail in our book. And I would say probably the most amazing piece of access that we got for this book was correspondence with Whitey Bulger's suspected killer, who has been writing us letters with a rubber-tipped pencil because he is in solitary confinement right now at a place called Misery Mountain, which is USP. That's the Bureau of Prisons in West Virginia. And they allow him only to use utensils that aren't sharp, which is why they give him the rubber tip pencils that he uses to write us letters, because they fear he's either going to try to commit suicide or kill a guard.
You had mentioned about the FBI, and I know that people that are in these parts realize that the FBI has had a little bit of a checkered past, certainly with John Connolly, et cetera, in Boston. So I know from talking with you before that this was a way that, in this story that you're telling, was a way for the FBI to get it right and essentially redeem themselves. So expand on that.
Yeah, to a degree, Mark. I wrote another true crime book called Animal, which is a book about notorious mob hitman Joe Barboza. Now, Joe Barboza was the first mobster that was really co-opted by the FBI in the early 1960s, and he was also the first organized crime figure ever inducted, so to speak, into the federal witness protection program. And, here comes Bulger about 10 years later, and, all of the same agents that had lured Joe Barboza to give up organized crime secrets did the same thing to Whitey Bulger. And again, it was a very incestuous relationship between the office of the FBI in Boston and organized crime here in Boston. Now, I looked at it in a different way. I said, okay, well, imagine, you, Mark, or anybody here in the audience, you go to work for a company and you don't know the background of the company, but, there are controversies in your company's past. Now, should you have to pay for those controversies and those wrongdoings? To some degree, I guess you should. But, the new brand of FBI agent that came around in the late 1990s and early 2000s, they did not know Whitey Bulger. They certainly did not know John Connolly at that time, but they were smeared by the same brush of corruption that both Connolly and Bulger were, and rightfully so. So they thought, okay, well, the only way we can redeem our office and our profession is to go out and chase this guy down. And that's what they did. It took years, more than a decade, to do it, and a lot of changes in their methodology rather, and their strategy. And we take you step by step through that journey with them until they put the handcuffs on Whitey Bulger and Catherine Gregg in 2011.
By the way, I neglected to mention this for our audience. If you've got questions for Casey, you're at the bottom of your screen, there's a chat feature. So type in your questions to chat, and when we're done here, I'll read those questions to Casey. Casey, you mentioned about the FBI. You mentioned about Catherine Gregg. What was Bulger's life like when he was on the run? You know, we always saw these pictures of this old man with the Red Sox cap, and that's the last we saw of him. What
Well,
was it?
that's the figure that the FBI hunted for 10 years. And you can imagine, Mark, or anybody in this audience, I could walk down Boylston Street on a crowded day in the summer and find you over a decade, was the number 2 ranked fugitive for the FBI, right behind Osama bin Laden, and eventually was elevated to number 1 after bin Laden was assassinated. So here is Bulger in his lion in winter phase of his criminal career. His body is breaking down, but he's still very crafty. He may not be as violent as he used to be, and we do have some explosions of violence in the book while he was on the run, but he has to be smart, and he has to really learn how to be a fugitive. And I think what separates him from, his gang members like Stevie the Rifleman Flemmy, John Materano, a few of these other guys that all got scooped up by law enforcement very quickly in the 1994 and 1995 is that Bulger had been planning for his escape for decades. And Bulger, as I said, became a student of being a fugitive. He used to, buy books that taught him how to obtain false identifications. Social security numbers were Bulger's currency, and he would purchase them off of people that were down on their luck, and he would pay for them in cash. And that allowed him to buy things in cash, rent his apartment without proper identification. So he tried to stay under the radar as long as he could.
So the FBI have been hunting this guy. They've been looking for this old man with the Red Sox cap. How do they finally crack the case?
Well, we take the case from helping to raise Teresa's children in South Boston. But Teresa,
can you repeat that? That one got cut off a little bit.
Sure. What I was saying, folks, is that Whitey Bulger at first went on the run in 1994, not with Teresa Stanley, his mistress, but with his girlfriend. Not with Catherine Gregg, his mistress, but with his girlfriend, Teresa Stanley. And she was not cut out to be a fugitive. She missed her family, and they had gotten as far as New Orleans, Louisiana, when she complained and wanted to go home to her family. And that's what he did. He took her back to Boston, still under the cover of night, and exchanged her for his mistress, Catherine Gregg. And all of a sudden they went on an odyssey. And a lot of people thought that Bulger had gone to Europe, and that's where he was hiding. Bulger had actually gone to Europe before 1994, to open up safety deposit boxes, which he certainly did. He traveled to Dublin. He traveled to London. He almost killed a guy on a subway in London, and we write about that in the book. But while he was a fugitive for 16 years, he stayed in the United States. And the first place he went to was Grand Isle, Louisiana, with Catherine Gregg, and they traveled under the aliases Tom and Helen Baxter. And while they were there, it's deep in the bayou. It's a very rural place. Not a lot of money in that area, and they befriended a family that didn't have a lot of material wealth. And Bulger was flush with cash and really took this family under his wing. Bought them groceries. They had dinner together almost every night. Purchased things for the kids, including eyeglasses for the children. Paid for their medical bills, etc. There's one interesting thing that we found out. I interviewed the family that Bulger had befriended. And their son, who was a teenager at the time, had a dog that was pregnant and had a litter of puppies. And one of the puppies had to be put down. And you can imagine in the bayou, they don't take that puppy to a vet. They take it out in the backyard and they put a bullet in that dog's body. And Bulger was so shaken by the fact that this little puppy was going to be killed and wept uncontrollably like a child. Meanwhile, Whitey Bulger is a man that was suspected in at least 19 murders and had killed at least 2 women with his bare hands. So it really speaks to the sociopathic behavior of Whitey Bulger.
You mentioned Catherine Gregg. What was life like for her? I mean, they clearly were a team.
They were, and she loved him. She wanted to be the number one in his life, and she certainly was. And when they first went on the run together, Bulger had one of his quirky behavior characteristics was he was demeaning toward women. He always was throughout his life, and demeaning toward just about everybody else. But as their relationship evolved and as they grew older together, Bulger really depended more on Catherine than Catherine depended on Bulger. She could have left at any given time and walked right into the police station or the FBI office and given herself up, but she didn't. She stayed on the run, and they created this, bizarre pseudo marriage with each other. And one thing I want to point out, one episode in the book, which I think is fascinating, and we tell the story for the first time, is that Bulger, despite his his smarts and, the fact that he could outwit a lot of the FBI fugitive hunters that were looking for him, he was also willing to gamble with his own freedom. And when I say that, what I mean is in 2006, when the movie The Departed first came out, and if anybody here remembers that movie, it starred Jack Nicholson. It won Best Picture for the Oscars, and it was a fictional version of Whitey Bulger's life in South Boston. Well, Whitey Bulger at the time is in San Diego because Catherine Gregg is traveling over the border to Mexico to buy, low-cost heart medication for Whitey. So he's got a few hours to kill. He goes to a screening of The Departed, and he's watching his fictionalized version of himself on the screen, and he's shaking his head at certain scenes. He's laughing at others. He's pointing to the screen. And why we know this is because 4 rows behind Bulger was a local police officer. And that police officer grew up in the Boston area and knew the Bulger story very well. And he made Whitey Bulger. He knew it was him. So here he is watching, this art imitating life type of experience, watching Bulger watch himself on screen, and the cop slips out of the theater before the lights go up and wants to make sure he's got a positive identification of Bulger in the lobby. And sure enough, he does. He knows that Sam Bulger has got some really unique characteristics, including a kind of a dirty front tooth that, Bulger really never smiled because he was always afraid of that tooth. So the cop sees that tooth, recognizes Whitey. Whitey at that time had the same beard that he later had when he was arrested. He was wearing a floppy hat and cargo shorts, but he also had a bulge under his polo shirt, which indicated a weapon. Now, this off-duty cop was not armed at the time, and he had to run back to the station, pick up his service weapon, and then chase Bulger down on a trolley headed to Tijuana. And Bulger gave him the slip, and poof, like Kaiser Soze in the movie The Usual Suspects, he just disappeared for the next 10 years.
You and David Wedge had the unique opportunity, experience, something, where you actually went to, you were in the apartment where he was. And
that's right. To be an investigative journalist and to be a writer, Mark, you really have to look, touch, and feel the things that you write about, and you have to see it through your characters' eyes, whether they're real life characters or they're fictional characters. So, we talked our way into the Princess Eugenia apartment building in Santa Monica, California. We didn't have an appointment. We rang the buzzer, and the building manager wouldn't let us in because we did identify ourselves as journalists from Boston. And a couple of seconds later, in walks a tenant with his 10-speed bike and says, "Would you guys want to come in to the apartment building?" We said, "Sure." And we did. And we began to knock on doors. And we went up to apartment 303, and we knocked on the door. That was Whitey and Catherine's apartment, and there was no answer. So we went back downstairs, and we knocked on a basement apartment door, and an old lady opened, and she was about 94 years old. Her name is Catalina Schlank. and she was Whitey and Catherine's beloved neighbor. And they would have dinner together. Whitey and Catherine would go shopping for her and drop off presents to her apartment. So she shows us about a dozen greetings cards from Catherine and Whitey under their new aliases, Charles and Carol Gasco. So you had Passover cards because Catalina was Jewish. You had New Year's cards, and it just spoke to the docile person that Catherine Gregg really was. Despite the fact that she went on the run with a monster, she was still looking for some, human engagement, and she found it with this little old lady. So Dave and I, we think we've scored, and we've got the greetings cards. We have this great interview with this sweet older woman, and as we're walking away from the apartment building, out comes a maintenance person, and he's yelling at us in Spanish. And I'm trying to diffuse the situation. I didn't want him to, cause a scene. I didn't want us to either. And I said, we're from Boston, and we're working on the Whitey Bulger story. And then a big smile comes up on this guy's face, and he goes, "Well, Bulger, he was arrested in the carport here in the garage." I said, "Yeah, no, we read about that. Would you like to see where he was arrested?" So we said, "Okay, this is interesting." So he takes us to the very spot where Bulger refused to kneel for the FBI before the handcuffs were slapped on his wrists. And then I asked the maintenance man, I said, 303, we knocked on the door, nobody's in there. I don't know, does anybody live there right now? And he goes, "Well, we're renovating it. Nobody's been in there since Bulger and Catherine, I think, had the apartment several years before. People were afraid to rent the place." So I said, "Okay, can we get access to it?" And sure enough, next thing you know, we're inside Bulger's very tight, small apartment. It was a 2-bedroom apartment on the 3rd floor, and we're walking the grid as law enforcement officials do, and getting a sense of what Bulger's daily life was like in this very confined space. And it was very interesting to be there. Bulger was long gone, but his presence could still be felt.
You told me that when the FBI were cracking the case, there's a couple of younger Cape guys that have a little role in the story too.
Right. Well, the police officer that spotted Whitey Bulger in San Diego is a sheriff's deputy named Richard Eaton, who was a 1986 graduate of Barnstable High School. And he had been in San Diego working, kind of against the drug cartels for over 20 years before he spotted Whitey Bulger. Now, fast forward to the, kind of the mid to late 2000s, another Barnstable High School graduate named Neil Sullivan is recruited as a U.S. Marshal onto the Bulger task force. And why that happened is because there was a female FBI agent named Noreen Gleason who basically shifted the paradigm in perspective on this entire case. As I mentioned to you earlier, Mark, and to the audience here, for over a decade, they'd been looking for an elderly white man in a baseball hat with glasses. Now, that generated thousands of tips that went nowhere. And Noreen Gleason said, "We're looking for the wrong person. Instead of looking for him, we need to look for her. We find her, we're going to find Whitey Bulger." So how do you do that? So she recruited fugitive hunters, real expert manhunters from FBI offices around the country, brought them to Boston to start looking at this case with a fresh set of eyes. And they started to knock on doors again. They knocked on Billy Bulger's door. They knocked on the doors to all the Bulger relatives and many of their neighbors, not thinking that they'd ever get cooperation, which they didn't, but they wanted to tell the family the heat is back on this case, and we're not going to give up until we find that bastard. And the FBI agents have strong language regarding the Bulger family. They don't like them at all, and they believe that Billy Bulger himself should have, shared a jail cell right next to his brother, because they believed that Billy was harboring this fugitive for well over a decade, and we found out evidence that he really was. So getting back to Noreen Gleason's new view on this case, she's started to really focus on Catherine Gregg, but they had bad surveillance images of Whitey Bulger in the past. They had even worse images of Catherine Gregg. It was one shot taken, with a surveillance lens from about 50 yards away, and she had sunglasses on. So through their interviews with people that knew Catherine, they discovered that Catherine had had cosmetic surgery. She had had breast augmentation. She had had rhinoplasty. She had had a lot of plastic surgery before she went on the run with Bulger. And in doing so, these plastic surgeons all needed to have real close-up photographs of Catherine. So they began to just go through every plastic surgery office in the Boston area until they stumbled on the office that Catherine had had the surgery at. They talked to the plastic surgeon himself, who I actually interviewed for the book. And the plastic surgeon, lo and behold, his father was a decorated FBI agent. So the guy says, I'm going to do everything I can to help you with this case. And we may have old files of Catherine. We don't know. But if we find the files, we'll let you know. So one of the fugitive hunters, a great FBI agent named Tom McDonald, he's back at the FBI office one night about to break free for his son's Little League game. He gets a call from the plastic surgeon, and the guy says, I found the files you're looking for. And Tommy Mack says, okay, well, I'll pick them up Monday after the weekend. And the guy says, well, do you want the photos too? Tommy Mack says, I'll be there in 5 minutes. And so when he got to the plastic surgeon's office, he had well over 20 close-up photographs of Catherine Gregg, which for the first time really kind of broke the case. So what the FBI did there is they created a public service announcement for the first time in Bureau history. Usually they would just give all this information to America's Most Wanted or to the media. And they said, you know what, screw this. We're going to create our own ad, and we're going to try to convince the public that Catherine is in fear for her life. Now, not believing that she was. They didn't know one way or the other how Bulger was treating her. But they wanted to instill this sense of urgency to the public. And they created an ad with these very close-up photographs of Catherine. And then they bought ad time in markets around the United States where they thought Bulger might be hiding. So they bought ad time in Louisiana, in Biloxi, Mississippi, in San Francisco, because Bulger had traveled to San Francisco many times before and after he was a fugitive, because he was an inmate at Alcatraz back in the 1960s. He was one of the last inmates there. And Alcatraz to Bulger was like his alma mater. It was like his Harvard. If you brag about where you went to college, Bulger bragged about where he went to prison. And so he loved San Francisco. However, the one market they could not afford to buy time in was LA, because it was too costly. So they would advertise this public service announcement, during the Ellen show, during Dr. Phil, where they believed a lot of women were watching at the time. And because that ad was so innovative at the time, it became a news story unto itself, Mark. CNN covered it as a news story. The BBC covered it as a news story. And lo and behold, the person that gave the tip that led to their arrest was living in Iceland at the time. She was an old neighbor of Whitey Bulger's, and she sees their pictures on TV. She dials up the FBI office in Boston, leaves 3 messages. And she's very angry by the 3rd message that she leaves, because nobody is getting back to her. So Neil Sullivan, the U.S. Marshal that I mentioned from Barnstable High School, he shows up to work the next day, and he's going through his notes, and he sees 3 different tips from the same tipster. And the tips are different from any other tip generated from that PSA, Mark, because they had an address.
Case, repeat that. You went silent again.
Security. Can you hear me now?
Yeah. They had an address. That's the last we heard.
Yes, they had an address and a name, 2 names, Charlie and Carol Gasco. And the FBI, fed those names into their international database, thinking that, some identification will come up. Nothing came up. They were living as ghosts in Santa Monica, California. So now the heat is really on them to at least visit this couple in Santa Monica. So they reach out to another fugitive hunter in LA who works for the FBI. His name is Scott Garriola. And again, we interviewed him for the book as well. Scott is on vacation with his two kids at a sporting goods store. And, he's buying fishing poles for a fishing trip. And he gets, on his cell phone, he gets a text. Possible Whitey Bulger sighting in Santa Monica, notify us right away. And Garriola, he's seen a bunch of these texts over the years, Mark. He didn't really take it too seriously. He was about to just delete the text when he thinks in his mind, well, it's Whitey Bulger. I have to see this through. So he calls the FBI in Boston. How valid is this tip? Well, the tip came in through one of our U.S. Marshals. And Garriola, as you know, and people that know law enforcement is very tribal, and they don't like to share information, which is unfortunate because it led to Bulger's disappearance for 16 years. But Garriola says, I don't really like the U.S. Marshals. I need to talk to the tipster myself. Get me on the phone with her in Iceland. And so they do. And so Garriola and the tipster walk through the scenario. And at the end, he asks her, how sure are you that these two people are Whitey and Catherine? And she says, well, Agent Garriola, I'm not 100% sure it's them. I'm 200% sure it's them. And at that point, it was game on.
Well, as somebody who has no intention of graduating from the University of Alcatraz, I'm happy with being from the University of Illinois in Northeastern. So Whitey's caught. He's arrested in the carport. What was his life like in prison?
It was interesting. He was convicted. They brought him back to Boston. Obviously, a lot of us covered and watched and followed the trial.
In case you're stuck again.
We have that for the first time in the book. And he befriends a Native American prisoner because Bulger had a very, despite the fact that Bulger was racist and he didn't like President Obama or he didn't like immigration policies. In fact, Bulger would often get in arguments with the tipster who eventually gave him up over politics. And she hated him because she was an Obama supporter and he wasn't. And unfortunately, his political beliefs, or fortunately, led to his arrest. But Bulger had an affinity for Native Americans, Native American art, so he befriends this Native American prisoner, and for the next 3 years, they correspond through letters. And again, we have 70 letters that have never been revealed before. Many of them are in the book, and a lot of them are between Bulger and this inmate. Bulger was, after his assassination attempt, he was sent to 2 other prisons, one in Florida and finally in West Virginia. When he gets to Florida, Bulger's whole body is broken down at that point, guys. He is no longer the tough guy from South Boston. He's now in a wheelchair. He's on a respirator. Inmates are trying to steal his sneakers in the prison yard. That's kind of how feeble Bulger had become. But he was still an ornery guy, and he would get in arguments constantly with fellow prisoners, his guards, and even the prison nurse. And during one argument with the prison nurse, he shouted, "Your day of reckoning is coming." Well, she was very afraid of that threat, and she reported it to the warden. So the warden, who was very close to the nurse, potentially too close to the nurse, quite frankly, took offense to Bulger's threat. And Bulger, his health condition was mysteriously upgraded over the next 24 hours. Bulger was deemed healthy enough to be transferred out of that prison into another. Now, Bulger should have been sent to a medical facility, but no, he wasn't. He was sent to USP Hazleton, which again is nicknamed Misery Mountain because it is the worst and most violent prison in the United States of America. And Bulger did not last 24 hours after his arrival.
Um, in your career, you've written about several rather memorable and violent people. Bulger, Joe Barboza. You obviously talked about in your book about the Boston Marathon bombing. Where does Bulger rank with all these? If you had to, if you had
Well,
to,
I mean, the Boston, Boston Strangler.
Case, can you repeat that? You went quiet again.
Important case I've ever worked on, but Bulger as a criminal, he's among the most notorious criminals in American history. And in our book, Hunting Whitey, we take you into the cell during Bulger's murder. We show you how and why he was killed.
Um, Speaking of that, you reveal startling new information about Bulger's murder in your book. What can you share with the audience? And obviously, we
Sure.
give it away all. We want people to buy the book.
We do. We do want that. People ask, was it a conspiracy? Was Bulger targeted for death? And I don't believe that he was. I think it was gross negligence that led Bulger to Hazleton, where he was killed. However, his murderer, a mobster named Freddie Gias from Springfield, Massachusetts, he had a vendetta to really carry out on behalf of an old cellmate of his who was put into prison for a murder he didn't commit by Whitey Bulger himself. So this was an opportunity for Freddie Gias to exact some type of revenge on behalf of his dear friend.
I'm going to see if I can share the screen here. In your book, you've actually got the last picture of him alive, I believe.
That's correct. Yeah, the last two pictures of Bulger alive we have in the book, and this is time that he spent in Tucson before he was stabbed. Yep, there's Bulger and his Native American art teacher. Bulger, it's interesting. All the previous pictures of Whitey Bulger, he's always scowling or he's pretending not to look at the surveillance cameras. But here he is in Arizona, and he's smiling. He's at least relatively healthy at that time, and he was really living off of his notoriety as Whitey Bulger, the man that created The Departed, if you will, and the man who Johnny Depp played in Black Mass.
Let's see. And what's this picture here?
That is a picture of Bulger with his art teacher and a couple of art students. Let's call them art students. They might be convicted killers. They probably are. But here in Arizona, they were using their mind in a much more peaceful, docile pursuit. Bulger's art teacher is a real nice guy. Actually, his name is Chip Janis, and Chip is now he's free. I mean, he was a guy that got caught up, on a federal gun charge. He lived on a reservation his whole life, but he's a really upstanding guy. He's got a new career for himself as a professional artist, and I'm very happy to tell everybody that he's doing well, and he was a huge help in researching and writing this book.
All right, I have one more question for you, then I'm going to turn this over to the audience. I've already seen some people are using the chat button here for some questions for you. So, what's next on the docket for Casey? What's your next project?
Divorce between Brady and Belichick and Kraft, if you will, that'll come out right before the NFL season, hopefully in September. We
Okay.
also
Can you repeat that, case. A little bit got cut off. Say it again.
We have an updated version of our book 12, which is about Tom Brady, which dives into new information about the divorce between Tom Brady and Bill Belichick. And make no mistake, it was a very bitter breakup between, two people that had spent 20 years together. Tom Brady should be, playing out his entire career with the New England Patriots, but the relationship had dissolved so badly. Tom Brady just had to leave. And we write about that extensively for the updated version of 12, which comes out in September. We've got another book coming out in December, and we partnered with James Patterson. Maybe you know that name, the #1 best-selling author in the world. And we wrote a nonfiction book called The Last Days of John Lennon. And that's exactly what it is now. This year is the 40th anniversary of John Lennon's assassination. And we flipped the entire story completely on its head with unprecedented access to people around that investigation. While even interviewed Paul McCartney for the book. We'll get a new insight to John's last years.
You always were my hero. You get to interview Paul McCartney. We got a question from an audience member here. When you visited the apartment, did you see the dummy wall where Whitey had hidden his money?
Yeah, that dummy wall, and he had cut out several, he basically knifed some sheetrock and he placed a lot of his weapons there. He placed $822,000 in cash. That was all, covered up by the time we got there, but we knew exactly where it was. And the interesting thing, guys, is that Bulger was planning for the gunfight at the OK Corral. He was not going to go out without, a blaze of glory, which makes the FBI's ability to lure him out of the apartment and a very kind of cat and mouse game that they played with him much more satisfactory to everybody involved, because they believed that Bulger would keep Catherine as a hostage and try to potentially threaten to kill her, or other neighbors would have been shot in the crossfire. But it was an interesting place. There was also a torso, a punching dummy that Bulger had kept by the balcony leading out to the street. And Bulger put a fedora cap on it because he wanted would-be assassins to believe that it was him. So if they were going to take a shot at him from a vantage point from across the street, they'd be shooting at a dummy instead of the real thing.
Now, here's a really good question from someone. Why do you think William Bulger talked to you after all of his years of silence?
It's a great question. Dave and I question ourselves that all the time. Dave actually got that interview and he just knocked on the door. And, Billy Bulger knew Dave from Dave's years of covering him at the Boston Herald and let him in. And Dave was shocked. And they spent an hour inside William's home talking about Whitey. And so for the first time in over a decade, Billy Bulger is kind of lifting the veil here, not only talking about his brother's life, but his brother's murder. Now, there is a wrongful death suit against the U.S. Bureau of Prisons by the Bulger family, and we'll see where that goes.
Okay. Any other questions from the audience? Now's your chance to ask Casey. All right. Well, Case, I want to thank you very much for taking the time tonight. I want to thank everybody for joining us tonight. We have another talk on Thursday at 7 o'clock talking about Jefferson's House, Monticello, and one on Saturday afternoon at 2 o'clock. We hope you join us for that. Case, great. Good luck with the book. It's already doing well. Hey, we got another question. Sorry, before you go. Did Whitey expect to eventually get caught? Did he have any contact with family or friends?
Well, that's a great question. I'll answer the second one first. We found out that Bulger would buy a car with cash while he was living in Santa Monica and drive all the way to the Midwest, all the way to Detroit, Michigan, where he would place a phone call to his brother Billy. And the reason why he took all of those precautions is because he believed that Billy's phones were tapped. And he thought, well, if the FBI is listening into our conversations, they're going to believe that I'm hiding out in Canada and not in Southern California. So again, Bulger went to great lengths to stay underground. Did Bulger think he was going to get caught? I mean, when after Osama bin Laden was killed in Pakistan, which elevated Bulger up to #1 on the FBI's most wanted list, at that point, he thought, okay, they're going to come gunning for me now. But Bulger told the FBI agents that I interviewed, he said, when, if I felt I was going to get really sick, and this is Bulger talking, he said, I was going to travel to somewhere out west, Nevada or Arizona, find an abandoned mine shaft and just drop my body down there and die, because he wanted to keep the mystery alive for generations to come. He never wanted the FBI to be able to put handcuffs on him or to be able to say, we got our man.
Well, on that note, Casey, thank you very much for joining us. Everybody, thank you for joining us tonight. We look forward to doing this again on Thursday. Case, good luck with the book, and we'll be talking to you. So thank you, everybody.
All right, thank you, everybody. I'm glad you guys all came out, and I hope you get the book. And it's a great, interesting summer read. And again, what you think about the Bulger story, this is a completely new direction that we take here. So there's a lot for everybody there.
All right. Good night, everyone.
Good night, everybody.